Well, thank you, Scott. Look forward to seeing the iron law of regulation spread. All right. And as a legislator, I'm going to go ahead and yield my time to Jay. I'm just kidding. All right. Well, it's great to be back with you. We're going to be talking about regulations, federal especially, and the impact that it's having on America and households and businesses, certainly across our land. I'll show you a couple of case histories of things that have really happened, and we'll go on from there. There we go. Okay, our friends at the EPA, the antithesis of cost-benefit analysis. We wish that they would have taken some steps to try to improve their cases, but that's just not going to happen. And in terms of the historic administrations, we do hope that Administrator Pruitt will change that picture dramatically and successfully for all Americans. So there's a 2016 conference spending report that they put out, and it was dated January 31st of this year. And there's just a quick look at what that did and what that meant. There was, back in September of 16 in Cincinnati, those attending on EPA's dime incurred average expenses of $2,226 per person over the 3-day span, or about $750 a day, all to gain a better understanding of regulatory and compliance challenges that confronted the states that they put on the states. Think about that. You're going to hear, after me, Dr. Lair give you some morsels to really consider in terms of where we can head in this country to improve conditions in our regulatory environment, especially with respect to the EPA. And it's certainly my opinion, and I think a lot of people agree with me, that the states, all 50 of them, are eminently capable of managing most of their own affairs with respect to their air and water environments. They've been doing a great job, and I think it's certainly time for the EPA federally to back off and to restructure itself materially. So as Jay shares his plan, I just want you to really contemplate the value of a new philosophy that could become involved at that federal level and really, really migrate most of the responsibilities back to the states. The George Mason University Mercatus Center here in Washington, D.C. has done some, I think, very interesting work with respect to evaluating regulations and the impacts in the United States activity areas. And that map you see there, all 50 states have been ranked with respect to the impact on their regulatory environment. The state of Kansas is 12th worst in the country. And you're going to see some evidence about the poor state of Louisiana, which ranks first worst, and the impact that it's had on their businesses. And so we'll show you that slide here in a moment. That's a simple little curve that demonstrates where we have gone since 1970 in this country. That's not just the EPA, that's all sorts of regulatory add-ons that have impacted Americans, and now we're just about 1.2 million regulatory restrictions that have greatly impacted our businesses and our lives. Kansas' top 5 industries restrictions are summarized in that graph. And you see the one that really won out there, so to speak, if you want to call it winning, is the group of professional, scientific, and technical services. Now, you might not look at Kansas and think, oh, there's all kinds of technology, and that's what it's famous for, but think about this. Boeing, Spirit, Cessna, Learjet were the air capital of the world in Wichita, Kansas, only. And so there's a lot of technology focused in just that county and region. And then you have Kansas City. You've got the world headquarters for Sprint. You've got Garmin Industries manufacturing all the GPS things that you, not all the GPS things, but some of them that you could be using. So there is a fair amount of opportunity for improvement in the regulatory environment across that piece, certainly. In Louisiana, if you've been to the Gulf Coast, and many of you probably have at some point or another, you've certainly seen in New Orleans and other facilities in that region the material installations with respect to chemical manufacturing and the lifeblood for that region. Of course, that's linked to the oil and gas industry. The offshore industry is focused out of New Orleans, and so there you go, over 65,000 regulations that relate to chemical products and manufacturing, and oil and gas came in second, oil and gas extraction about 14,000. McLaughlin Shearhouse, that's Patrick and McLaughlin and Oliver Shearhouse at Mercatus Center, produced this interesting summary, and notice that at the very top, petroleum and coal products manufacturing and electric power generation, transmission and distribution add up to more than 46,000 regulations that they get to deal with on a daily basis, and the magnitude of extra responsibility that certainly has put on them. And compare that to the bottom of the list, Big Pharma, the 11,500 regulations that they get to deal with. I don't know how that came about, but I guess because you would think that our health would matter, and that the way that the various federal organizations would relate to that would be maybe a little bit larger number in comparison to those others. Finally, on this series, we've got sources of regulations for wholesale trade. And I guess there's no surprise who leads the pack on that set of regulations. And that kind of surprised me when you look down at the very near the bottom of the list, the IRS coming in a mere 749. I'm thinking, my gosh, the IRS, they're the biggest impact on a big part of my life, but they are way off scale, lower by a factor of 10% of what you got for the EPA's input. So let's hope that we can change that soon. I say enough is enough. There is some real endangerment out there. I was just reading before I left to come to the conference about Energy Transfer Partners' hope for initiation of oil flow through the Dakota Access Pipeline, and reports were that the night before that there had been uncovered evidence of tampering with surface installations. Most of the pipelines are underground, but with respect to some of the surface installations that were gated and locked, they found evidence that somebody had come into the pipeline and used a blowtorch to put a hole in one of the pipelines. And can you imagine the magnitude of potential damage that could have occurred if they hadn't seen it in advance before they opened the flow? They were ready to go, but they're doing some final inspections, and there were more than one of those instances. So there's a reason for states to take actions to prosecute and to take whatever measures are necessary to protect the American people against insurgencies like what we did experience at the Dakota Access Pipeline before they finally got the thing really finally permitted and going forward. It's serious business, so some of the states are recommending fines of up to $100,000 per person and jail time up to 7 years if you get caught. Now, a lot of those folks are going in with masks and you can't see them, so they can't be identified. So some states are actually saying, we want to be able to make sure that we can identify you, so you will not be allowed to wear masks and do the things you've been doing to try to upset balances in these installations. So, and there are 8 states, Colorado, Iowa, Michigan, Minnesota, Missouri, North Dakota, Virginia, and Washington State that have introduced legislation, and one of them has already failed so far this year. Okay, sustainability and climate change. Those are just a few of the federal agencies, departments, that have headline mantras that speak loudly and clearly to their intent to disseminate the damage to our climate that we're doing, and that we've got to stop somehow because of the movements that are supporting them. And this is by no means comprehensive. You got 400 American universities, that many of them are federally funded, who are also at the front lines trying to defend this indoctrination that the United States of America has been suffering for the last 40 years. And I think we need to do something about that. Maybe we need to take some money away from the universities. Here's the Department of Interior. One example, climate change. This is a website shot from this week. It's still out there. Now, I want to applaud Secretary Zinke for beginning to take some steps that need to be taken to reroute that agency, because Interior has a very big impact. U.S. Geological Survey is a part of that, and it matters to Americans that they do things right, and there is responsibility. They have a large responsibility area in the Gulf of Mexico installations and activities that occur down there, and they've regulated that substantially. I say the U.S. Department of NOAA, also known as the Department of Commerce. I say that because the budget for NOAA, fiscal year 2017, is $9.7 billion, just under 10, and their share of NOAA's share of that budget is $5.8 billion. 60% of the Department of Commerce's budget is focused on NOAA. Now, maybe I'm just way off and thinking that that's a little too much for regulating our oceans and helping the whales do what the whales want to do. I'm just saying. Impact of regulation in Kansas. Well, since 2009, the year that Kathleen Sebelius, somebody whose name you might remember, handed off governorship to a guy named Mark Parkinson. And Mark Parkinson was negotiating a deal with a company in western Kansas called Sunflower Electric Power Company, one of the larger distributors of electricity in western Kansas. Electricity that could go to Colorado, to other nearby states and what have you. And they had a permit, but the legislature was not quite ready to release the privilege of their desired expansion of that Sunflower Electric Power Plant by a factor of about 2. And so at the end of the day, the deal got cut between Mark Parkinson and Sunflower Electric Power Company that would allow them to expand, but they would have to just casually introduce in the Kansas legislature mandates for renewable power, which in Kansas means wind. So the deal was cut. 10% renewable capacity by 2011, 15% by 2015, and 20% by 2020. And so the legislation passed, and shortly thereafter, Secretary of Health and Environment said, well, that permit wasn't good enough. We need to go back and revisit that, so you're going to have to answer some more questions. They went back and they reconstructed the permit, and it was approved. But then we had our friends from the Sierra Club and all sorts of other organizations put lawsuit after lawsuit after lawsuit on Sunflower's desk, and today, 2017, they're still not started with reconstruction of that and expansion of that power plant. I would just say that the legislature exhibited a clear violation of the iron law, and if they had something like that in front of them to consider, that they might have thought twice about the magnitude of the regulations and whether the cost-benefit analysis would really be a fit for the state of Kansas. This is a record of my electricity consumption since 2009, late 2009 to January of this year. I just want to point out a couple things. The blue dots, and there's a gap in there because my wife lost some records and I didn't have a chance to go back and find them. But the blue dots are on a trend that increased. That's a total cost per kilowatt hour for heating and cooling my home, and it went up 50% since the end of 2009. 50%. The yellow trend is transmission cost per kilowatt hour. That's over 100% increase in price since 2009. Now, Westar would try to tell you that the red line down there was the most expensive part of their going forward with their business model because that's where the environmental costs came in. They had to pay them or they would be fined and so forth. But you can see with your own naked eye that the environmental costs at the end of the day became relatively minimal. Okay, energy.gov. Rick Perry's there. There's the web shot, climate change at the very top of it. That department in the past has aided and abetted the war against fossil fuels probably as much as any other agency besides the EPA. And I do hope that we've got some opportunity in the future to see that materially changed, and I'll be certainly encouraging Secretary Perry to do that. This is kind of my favorite one. I'm going to give you a little bit more insight. As chairman of Energy and Environment Committee in the Kansas House, I was a member of the Energy Council, and so we were invited to Santa Fe, New Mexico, summer of 2015, to hear a presentation that was sponsored by Los Alamos National Laboratory, specifically Dr. Terry Wallace. You can see his credentials there. Principal Associate Director of Global Security at Los Alamos. And he started sharing some very interesting facets of what they look at and what they manage, and some big responsibilities, globally speaking. And I was impressed with the first 5 minutes of his 45-minute talk. And then he quickly drifted into sustainability, climate change, and the risks that all that poses on American citizens, and we've really, really got to watch that. He made the comment that by 2030, the oceans of the world are going to be fished out, and he started talking about the 9 billion people that were also going to be populating the planet by 2030, and all the risks with that increased population, our inability to feed the people, and I sat on my hands, and there were 50 or 60 legislators and their wives and spouses listening to this, and I just kind of looked around the room, watching the reactions, and oh my, people were, this is terrible, we're polar bears are going to, all disappear, all that stuff. Well, I had to write him a letter, and so that's the header for the letter. But when he's talking about the 9 billion people, no way to feed them, there's no space. I just said, if you just think about this, I gave him a little image of spreading your arm out 6 feet in that direction as far as you can go, and then space the next row out same distance. With that kind of a spacing, and I had heard prior to that you could fit the entire globe's population inside the state of Texas. I thought, is that right? Well, if you do the math just on what I just showed you there, that's 3.6% of the state of Texas spread out 95 miles by 95 miles. That's the rectangle that would encase the entire global population at that spread. Now, that'd be about an 8.5-foot hypotenuse. You probably wouldn't want to sleep there too long if that's all the space you had. But that's theoretically, what's involved here. If you took those 9 billion people and spread them out across the entire state of Texas, every person would get 1.6 acres to do what they need to do. And that's just Texas, which is 0.3% of the globe's land surface area. So that was one thing. I had to send him one graph. The blue shaded area represents the oscillation, monthly average temperature in the United States of America. This is NOAA data. This is nothing's manipulated. It's just what it is. And I think you can see from 1895 on the far left part of that graph over to approximately present day. Really, it was 2011, but things haven't materially changed in that time frame. That the black dot's CO2 concentration in that same time frame we've seen this many times, the trend is dramatically upward. But the monthly temperatures, and I think I can, up there, the maximum daily temperature occurred in 1936, Dust Bowl days in Kansas, okay? Minimum temperature is January of 1979. So those are the hard data facts about temperature and CO2 concentration, which would scare Dr. Wallace. There's a correlation you can trust. Global population, same time frame. There's a 95% correlation coefficient between global population and CO2 concentration. Everybody's breathing, thank God. And they need to keep doing that. Okay, President Trump's desire to cut 25% out of the EPA's budget, I think is just wonderful. And I hope he can go further. But at the very bottom of that list, notice those 2 items, environmental education and environmental justice. What has that done for America? What in the world has that done for America, other than influence other countries to be more belligerent and opposed to fossil fuel delivery and cheap energy, which is what America and the world needs, and it's just so sad. Second page, just a few more things that are focused. I'm not going to discuss the details there, but hopefully most, if not all, of those items that he has identified for excision or serious adjustment will actually occur. I just have a couple of conclusions that I would pose. I would say that we must aggressively trim and restructure and eliminate multiple programs within the federal system that have any association with the god of sustainability, which is where climate change came from, and especially in starting with the EPA. And secondly, it's incumbent upon us to strive to deliver the truth to the American people with good science, properly constructed legislation, and policy making that is grounded in the iron law of regulation. That's all I've got. Thank you.